Good evening, this is Mr. Smith coming to you with your first video cast or screencast of the year. Today we're going to start off the school year talking about early explorations and the conquest and really setting the standard for the colonization of America. When we talk about America and the explorations, obviously the first person that comes to mind is Christopher Columbus. And I'm sure if you think back to when you were in elementary school, there were all these preconceived ideas that people thought the world was flat before Christopher Columbus. Well, I'm sorry to let you know, but that's not necessarily the case. Many people knew that the world was round thanks to Galileo and some of his inventions in the 12th and 13th century, but what they didn't know was how big the earth was, how far the ocean went, what was on the other side. And part of Christopher Columbus and other explorers' thoughts were that if they just continued to go westward instead of round Africa, that eventually they would run into Asia. And some people thought even that would even be a quicker route to get to Asia. When you look at the world before Christopher Columbus in 1492, you see there's some, really interesting ideas, so to speak, from explorers. One is that this notion that everything is based in Europe. Okay, and let me get my little uh, clicker here. You see Europe is here with the Mediterranean being the hot spot. That's the major part here because most of the trade that went on during the world came from the Mediterranean into the African coasts down into the Arabian and Red Sea, and then on occasion it would go into the Indian Ocean and the Arabian Sea. Right? And see, Asia was such a hot commodity of spices and golds and silvers and silk. And so a lot of the entrepreneurs of Europe try to find ways to get to Asia. Right? So that kind of leads us into the motives of explorers. Right? When we think about why Christopher Columbus, why some of Drake and Magellan and some of those explorers, why they ventured off westward, we first have to look at Asia, right? Again, that's going to be a major hotspot for Europe and most of the world up until about World War I, World War II. But see, what was happening, and if you think back to your modern world history or AP World, is crusades were being fought all throughout the Middle East, and it was curbing the entrepreneurs' ability to get to Asia. If you go back to the map on the previous page, most of the traders would go through the Mediterranean, get to the Middle East, then they would take a caravan across the Middle East into Asia. Sometimes they would take it across the Middle East into the Arabian Sea and then sail to Asia. Right? But that costs a lot of money to go through the Christian fighters, then go through the Muslim fighters. Everybody was charging traders and caravans money to cross through their land. All right, so that's one motive. All right, another motive happened to be a result of the Renaissance. All right, this idea of other people and other lands. Curiosity. If you think about it, that curiosity that originated with the Renaissance hasn't really left us. We're still looking for the unknown, aliens, and whatever there might be. Okay. Um, Now the next couple of motives, if you think again, this is some of what a refresher, so to speak, from modern world history or AP World, has to do with the three G's of exploration. All right, the first one is God. If you remember back to the class, there was all sorts of religious persecutions, religious fights, disagreements within the church, the Catholic Church, the Protestant churches. You had the Reformation, and so there was a real push, so to speak, physically and emotionally and religiously, to find other places to live, to worship God their own way. All right, and so when we think about God as being a motive, you had a religious missionaries, the whole idea of going out and Christianizing those who weren't like them, and then also going out and finding a place where you can worship God how you wanted. All right, so that was 1G. All right. The next one kind of relates back to the Crusades, so to speak, but this is the time period in Europe where everybody's trying to make money. The kings and queens and the countries are all fighting for sources of revenue and wealth. The population has picked back up in Europe after the Black Plague, and now the kings and queens want some wealth. They want money, right? And they're kind of being tapped out of their European sources of wealth and their African sources of wealth. And again, Asia, that's the place where they want to go. That's where they need to go. So they want to explore for gold. All right. Now, technological advances, that's somewhat of a byproduct of the exploration as well as a correlation to exploration. A number of technological advances, which we'll look at in a second here, are going to result from explorers as well as we're going to help explorers. All right, so that's a motive. Better technology allows them, gives them security to explore. All right, and then the last one I call it, who's the top dog. The whole idea here is, these kings and queens are trying to find new sources of wealth. They're trying to fight for territory. Think about, again, the Crusades. They're trying to stake their claim religiously within the church, whether it's the Protestant or the Catholic Church. So it's this fame and fortune, right? The country that has the most territories, the most gold, the most wins in war and battle, they have the glory. They're the top dog, all right? And so there's this definite competition between some of Europe's major powers. All right, so those are your 3 G's of exploration: God, gold, and glory. All right. As I mentioned before, there are a number of technological advances that occurred during this time period, during the 15, 14, 1600s, these 300 years, so to speak. One, the astrolabe, just helps with geography and sailing, but I think one of the most significant advances has to be the map making ability. All right, just the sheer number of maps are going to multiply during the next 100 years or so, leading up to and through Christopher Columbus. Then you have the sextant. Go ahead and giggle, but the sextant, if you think about it and look at it, it actually helps with weather, and it allowed sailors to help track storms and look at the stars and see like what possible weather occurrences might be on the horizons. All right, and then obviously the compass, and it had a major influence in technology and sailing. All right, but probably the most important figure for sailing during this time period happens to be Prince Henry of Portugal. All right, he creates this school of navigation in 1419, which allows and trains it trains and allows sailors to really develop better ships, better sailing techniques, strategies for handling the weather, for handling the waves and the ocean currents and things like that. And though Portugal isn't going to become a powerhouse necessarily in the exploration field, they will field a number of sailors that will help other countries, and kind of like mercenary sailors.